My son shoved me so hard my ribs cracked against the wrought iron patio table, screaming that I was a nobody, a parasite living in his basement and demanding I get out of his house. What he did not know was that the crisp piece of paper resting in my breast pocket was a verified lottery ticket worth $20 million. I did not fight back. I simply looked at him, said, "All right," and packed a single bag. 24 hours later, I was boarding a first-class flight to a private villa in Tuscany, leaving him to drown in the financial trap he had built for himself. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed his perfect illusion, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly cut toxic blood ties to save your own life. Now let me take you back to that humid Saturday afternoon in August. The air in the backyard was thick with the smell of expensive cologne, sweet perfume, and burning charcoal. My daughter-in-law Vanessa was hosting what she called an end-of-summer influencer gala. In reality, it was just 50 people from the local country club she was desperately trying to impress, hoping to gain traction for her social media pages. I was 69 years old, a retired construction site manager with an aching back and arthritic knees, and I had been assigned the role of unpaid caterer. The silver tray I was carrying was incredibly heavy loaded with imported Wagyu steaks Vanessa had ordered on a high-interest credit card. My hands were slick with sweat from standing over the grill for 3 hours. As I navigated through the crowd of women in silk sundresses and men wearing expensive loafers without socks, my worn-out work boot caught the raised edge of a loose slate tile on the patio. I stumbled forward, unable to catch my balance. The heavy silver platter tipped out of my hands, and $500 worth of prime meat slid onto the manicured grass right at the feet of the local bank manager. The upbeat lounge music playing from the outdoor speakers seemed to stop instantly. The lively chatter died. I dropped to my knees, my joints protesting loudly, frantically, trying to salvage the expensive steaks before they were ruined. But before my trembling fingers could even touch the grass, a pair of hands violently grabbed my shoulders. My son Matthew practically lifted me off the ground and shoved me backward with a force that knocked the wind completely out of my lungs. I crashed hard into the sharp edge of the wrought iron table behind me. The pain flared hot and bright across my ribcage, radiating down my spine, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the sting of his voice. Matthew stood over me, his face twisted in a mask of absolute rage and disgust. He did not care who was watching. He did not care that his elderly father was bleeding. "Get out of my house," he screamed, his voice cracking with fury and echoing across the silent yard. "You are a clumsy old fool. You are nobody. You are just a parasite living in my basement, draining our resources and embarrassing us in front of people who actually matter. Pack your garbage and get out right now." I stayed on the ground for a long, agonizing moment, listening to the murmurs of the wealthy guests. They were whispering behind their hands, casting glances of pity mixed with deep revulsion at the pathetic old man bleeding on the patio. A younger version of myself, the man who used to wrestle steel beams and shout over roaring diesel engines, would have stood up and taught the arrogant boy a brutal lesson in respect. But I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue or beg for his forgiveness. Instead, I slowly reached up and pressed my palm firmly against the breast pocket of my faded flannel shirt. Beneath the worn, sweat-stained fabric, I felt the sharp, crisp edge of a small piece of cardboard. It was the lottery ticket I had scanned at the corner store at 6 o'clock that very morning. The machine had played a cheerful little tune, and the clerk's eyes had nearly popped out of his skull when the screen displayed the grand prize of $20 million. The money was real. It was mine. And the bitter irony of my son's cruel words tasted like copper in my mouth. Get out of his house. The absolute audacity of that statement echoed loudly in my mind as I looked up at the sprawling cedar and stone structure looming behind him. I knew every single inch of that massive house because I had built it with my own 2 hands 20 years ago. I had poured the concrete foundation. I had framed the wooden walls in the dead of winter, my fingers numb from the freezing cold, sacrificing my weekends and evenings so my wife and I could have a beautiful dream home. When she passed away from illness a decade later, the house became a sacred shrine to her memory. Every room held a piece of her. But 5 years ago, Matthew came to me in the middle of the night, sobbing uncontrollably. His luxury car sales business was tanking, he owed dangerous people a lot of money, and he was facing total bankruptcy and potential jail time. He begged me for help. Like a naive fool blinded by a father's unconditional love, I signed the deed of my dream home over to him so he could leverage the massive equity and save his neck. The ink on the legal transfer was barely dry when Vanessa decided my spacious master bedroom would make a perfect yoga studio for her videos. They abruptly moved my belongings down to the unfinished, damp basement surrounding my bed, with exposed plumbing pipes and cold concrete walls. For 5 long years, I lived like a silent ghost in the home I built, quietly handing over my modest monthly pension, just to cover the skyrocketing utility bills their lavish lifestyle constantly demanded. They treated me not as a loving father, but as an embarrassing, unwanted tenant who was constantly in their way. He called me a parasite, yet he was standing over me wearing a custom-tailored suit, bought directly with the equity of my lifelong sweat and blood. I looked up into Matthew's eyes, searching for even a tiny flicker of remorse or hesitation. There was none. He was eagerly waiting for me to grovel, to plead for my damp, miserable corner of the basement. He needed to assert his dominance in front of his wealthy country club friends to feed his fragile ego. I pressed my hand against the warm metal of the table and pushed myself up to my feet. My bruised ribs throbbed violently with every breath I took, but my mind had never been clearer in my entire life. The warm, comforting illusion of family completely shattered in that exact moment, sweeping away years of misplaced guilt and desperate, foolish hope. I brushed the dirt and grass clippings from my worn jeans, looked my son dead in the eye, and spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm and terrifyingly steady. "All right," I said softly. "I will be gone in an hour." Matthew blinked rapidly, taking a half step back, clearly unnerved by my complete lack of emotion. He opened his mouth to say something else, perhaps to hurl another degrading insult to regain control of the situation, but I had already turned my back on him. I walked slowly through the sliding glass doors, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the wealthy guests, and headed straight down the narrow, creaking wooden stairs to the basement. The air down there smelled heavily of mildew and old dust. I pulled a battered canvas duffel bag from under my narrow military-style cot. I did not pack much. I took a few changes of comfortable clothes, my leather toiletry bag, and a small framed photograph of my late wife smiling on our honeymoon. That was all. I deliberately left behind the heavy oak dresser I had hand-carved from a fallen tree in the yard. I left behind my antique pocket watch collection that Vanessa had been eyeing greedily for years, constantly dropping not-so-subtle hints about how much money they would fetch at an upscale auction. I left the vintage power tools, the heavy winter coats, everything that tied me to a miserable life of servitude and silent endurance. Let them have the carved wood and the shiny metal. They were about to learn the hard way that those inanimate objects could not pay a massive mortgage. As I zipped the canvas duffel bag closed, I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of lightness wash over my entire body. I was no longer a tired old man waiting to die in a dark basement. I was a man with a lethal amount of financial resources and absolutely nothing left to lose. I took one last long look at the gray concrete walls, made a silent, solemn promise to my late wife that I was finally going to start taking care of myself, and walked up the stairs for the final time. When I stepped out the heavy wooden front door, the party in the backyard was still unnaturally quiet. I walked down the long paved driveway and tossed my duffel bag into the bed of my rusted pickup truck. The old engine whined loudly in protest before sputtering to life, coughing a thick cloud of blue exhaust smoke into the pristine suburban air. Just as I shifted the heavy gear column into drive, the front door of the house violently swung open. Vanessa marched out onto the porch clutching a half-empty crystal glass of expensive champagne. She stood there, a triumphant, ugly sneer twisting her perfectly manicured features. "Do not even think about calling us when you run out of gas money, Calvin," she shouted loudly over the rumbling of my engine, making sure the neighbors could hear her. "We are not giving you a single dime of our money. You are completely on your own now." I rolled down the manual window, feeling the warm summer breeze hit my bruised face. I smiled at her. It was a genuine, deeply relaxed smile that seemed to confuse and anger her deeply. "I appreciate the financial advice, Vanessa," I replied calmly, my voice completely devoid of the bitter sadness she craved so desperately. "Enjoy the house." I rolled the window back up, put the old truck in gear, and drove down the quiet suburban street without looking in the rearview mirror even once. I did not drive to a cheap roadside motel to lick my wounds. I did not drive to an old friend's house to cry on their shoulder and complain about my ungrateful son. I merged directly onto the interstate highway and drove straight toward the towering glass buildings of the city, heading for the State Lottery Commission headquarters. The long drive took 2 hours, giving me plenty of uninterrupted time to formulate a meticulous, devastating plan of action. By the time I parked my truck in the concrete visitor lot, my heavy grief had completely transformed into a cold, highly calculated sense of purpose. I walked into the lobby, bypassed the loud public claiming center, where people were taking photos with oversized cardboard checks, and used a private contact number provided by the lottery concierge service for high-tier winners. Within minutes, I was escorted by security into a quiet, mahogany-paneled boardroom on the top floor, where a dedicated team of financial advisors and legal experts were waiting for me. That was where I met Oliver. Oliver was not just a regular lawyer. He was a ruthless shark in a bespoke tailored suit, an elite wealth management attorney who specialized exclusively in protecting the massive assets of the ultra-rich and navigating highly complex, aggressive financial disputes. I sat across the polished wooden table from him and explained exactly what I needed him to do. I told him I did not want public fanfare or my face on the evening news. I wanted an ironclad, blind trust. I wanted absolute, impenetrable anonymity. And more importantly, I wanted a man who could legally and systematically dismantle my son's entire life without me ever having to throw a single physical punch. Oliver listened quietly to my story, without interrupting his sharp, calculating eyes, taking in the dark bruises forming on my ribs and my worn-out work boots. When I finished speaking, he reached into his leather briefcase and slid a thick stack of complicated legal paperwork across the table toward me. "For a retainer of $200,000, which we will extract directly from your first automated payout, I will not only secure your $20 million, Calvin," Oliver said smoothly, tapping a heavy gold pen against the desk. "I will also ensure that whoever is currently occupying your former residence learns a very painful, permanent lesson in fiscal responsibility." I did not hesitate. I signed the documents. The anonymous trust was officially established under a corporate shell name. Within 3 hours, the first massive wire transfer hit a newly created, highly secured offshore banking account. My old, miserable life was officially dead, buried forever under an avalanche of zeros. Leaving the imposing lottery headquarters, I drove my truck directly to a shady used car lot on the edge of the city, sold the vehicle for $1,000 in crisp cash, and took a taxi directly to the international airport terminal. I had no specific itinerary planned. I only knew I wanted to go somewhere far away, somewhere where the local wine was rich and the evening air did not smell like bitter regret and betrayal. I walked confidently up to the premium airline ticketing counter and purchased a first-class one-way ticket to the rolling hills of Tuscany, Italy. Hours later, as I sat comfortably in the luxurious, oversized leather seat of the airplane sipping a glass of incredibly expensive vintage scotch, while we soared 30,000 feet above the dark waters of the Atlantic Ocean, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I did not block Matthew's phone number. That would be entirely too easy and too merciful. Instead, I opened my mobile banking application and stared at the screen showing my modest checking account, the one that held my meager monthly pension. It was the exact account Matthew secretly had administrative access to, the account he routinely and illegally used to skim money to pay his expensive country club membership fees. I smiled to myself in the dim lighting of the cabin, took a long, satisfying sip of my scotch, and turned my phone off. Let him think I was completely gone. Let him think he had won the war. The current silence was not a surrender. It was simply the calm, terrifyingly quiet receding of the ocean before a massive tsunami, and I was about to rain down absolute financial hell on his perfect, entitled little world. 2 weeks had passed since I walked down that driveway. I was sitting on the sun-drenched terrace of a private stone villa perched high in the rolling green hills of Tuscany. The morning air was crisp and smelled of wild rosemary and damp earth. Far below, a sea of grapevines stretched out toward the horizon, glowing beautifully in the early Italian sunlight. I took a slow sip of my espresso, feeling the rich, dark warmth settle in my stomach. The bruised ribs from my son shoving me against the patio table had faded into a dull ache, but the deep emotional wounds were finally starting to close. For the first time in 20 years, I woke up without the crushing weight of anxiety pressing down on my chest. I did not have to listen to Vanessa complaining about my footsteps on the floorboards above my basement room. I did not have to watch Matthew strut around in designer suits paid for by my sweat and sacrifice. I was completely alone, and it was the most magnificent peace I had ever experienced. The profound silence of the valley was suddenly broken by a soft, sharp chime coming from the glass table. My cell phone screen lit up, vibrating against the smooth surface. I set my espresso cup down and picked up the device. It was an automated security alert from the small regional bank back in my hometown in America. The notification was simple but incredibly telling. Someone had just attempted to bypass the security questions on my basic checking account. They had failed the two-factor authentication, but they were persistently trying to guess the new passwords I had set up before I left the country. I leaned back in my chair, a slow, knowing smile spreading across my face. I knew exactly who was frantically pounding on the keyboard thousands of miles away. It was Matthew. To understand why my son was desperately trying to hack into a retired construction worker's modest checking account, you have to understand the fragile house of cards he had built his entire life upon. Matthew was a luxury car salesman, a job that requires projecting an image of massive wealth. He wore expensive watches and drove leased sports cars to convince his wealthy clients that he was one of them. Vanessa was even worse, bleeding money dry to maintain an illusion of high society dominance for her internet followers. But the ugly truth was that their extravagant lifestyle was completely unsustainable on his fluctuating commission checks. They were drowning in massive debt. Years ago, under the guise of being a responsible son wanting to help his aging father manage bills, Matthew convinced me to give him the login credentials to my personal bank account. That account was where my union pension was deposited on the first day of every single month. It was exactly $2,500. It was money I had broken my back for lifting steel and pouring concrete for 4 decades. I thought he was using it to pay for my groceries and my share of the utilities. But I had slowly discovered the sickening reality during my long, silent nights in the basement. Matthew was systematically draining every single penny of my pension the exact moment it hit the account. He was using my retirement money to cover the massive shortfall on the mortgage of the house he had stolen from me. My hard-earned pension was the only thing keeping the bank from foreclosing on their fake, glamorous life. Now, looking at the timestamp on the security alert, the picture became crystal clear. It was the 3rd day of the new month back in the States. For the first time in 5 years, the automatic transfer of my pension had not gone through. Before I left the country, I had quietly redirected my pension to my new impenetrable offshore trust, leaving my old checking account completely empty. The sudden absence of that $2,500 was a catastrophic blow to Matthew's carefully balanced financial juggling act. I closed my eyes and pictured the absolute panic currently unfolding in my old living room. I could easily imagine Matthew sweating through his expensive dress shirt, staring in horror at a bright red past due notice on his laptop screen. The massive mortgage payment was bouncing. The credit card minimums were due. The luxury car leases were calling for their monthly pound of flesh. Without my money to quietly plug the gaping holes in their sinking ship, the water was finally rushing in. He had confidently thrown me out like yesterday's garbage, fully expecting my money to stay behind and continue serving him. He truly believed I was too stupid or too old to sever the financial cord. The phone chimed again. A second failed login attempt. He was getting desperate. I knew Vanessa was likely screaming at him, demanding to know why her cards were being declined at her favorite expensive salons. They probably assumed I was sleeping in my rusty truck in some grocery store parking lot, too pathetic to change my banking passwords. They had no idea I was sitting in a multi-million-dollar Italian estate watching their entire world begin to catch fire. I swiped the notification away and opened my encrypted messaging application. It was time to reach out to Oliver, my wealth management attorney back in the city. The trap I had laid was perfect, but it needed a tiny bit of bait to truly spring shut. If I simply locked Matthew out completely, he might panic and try to sell the house immediately to cover his debts. I could not allow that. I needed him to feel a false sense of security. I needed him to believe he was still the smartest person in the room right up until the moment the floor collapsed completely beneath his feet. I began typing a highly specific set of instructions to Oliver, preparing to loosen the noose just enough for Matthew to happily slip his own neck inside. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct private number Oliver had given me before I left the States. Because of the time difference, it was still the middle of the night in America, but a man like Oliver did not sleep when there were millions of dollars to manage. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and completely alert. I explained the barrage of security notifications I was receiving. I told him my son was frantically trying to smash through the digital locks on my old checking account. Most lawyers would have immediately advised me to freeze the account, call the local authorities, and file a standard police report for attempted theft. But I did not hire a standard lawyer. I told Oliver that blocking Matthew was simply putting a temporary bandage on a gaping wound. If we locked him out completely, he would just find another desperate and sleazy way to keep his fake lifestyle afloat. He might try to take out a predatory loan using the house as collateral, or worse, he might try to track me down to force me to sign over more assets. I needed him to feel a sudden rush of victory. I needed him to believe his own lies, to think he was a genius who had successfully outsmarted his useless old father. I instructed Oliver to create a brand new digital checking account, a decoy. We needed to bait this trap perfectly so he would not hesitate. I authorized Oliver to transfer exactly $5,000 from one of my minor trust dividends into this new decoy account. It was a highly calculated amount. $5,000 was just enough to temporarily stop the bleeding of his past due mortgage and perhaps pay off a single credit card minimum, but it was not nearly enough to actually save him from drowning entirely. It was a brief taste of fresh air for a man trapped deep underwater. Then came the most crucial part of the plan. I told Oliver to link the decoy account to my old banking profile, but to intentionally weaken the security firewall. Oliver is an absolute master of digital financial warfare. He arranged for the bank's automated security system to offer a password reset option based on my old, easily guessable security questions. Questions like the name of my first pet or the street I grew up on. These were trivial details Matthew knew effortlessly. We were essentially leaving the back door of the bank wide open, turning off the alarm system, and leaving a pile of cash right on the kitchen table. Oliver chuckled softly over the phone, fully understanding the ruthless beauty of the strategy. He warned me that by doing this, we were knowingly allowing a serious crime to take place. I told him that was exactly the point. We stayed on the line together in comfortable silence, watching the digital logs update on Oliver's end. It only took Matthew 10 minutes to realize the security parameters had changed. He requested a password reset. He correctly answered the security questions. I could practically see his greedy hands shaking over his laptop keyboard in his dark living room. The system granted him access. He was officially inside the decoy account. He did not pause for even a single second. He did not stop to wonder why my pension account suddenly had $5,000 instead of the usual $2,500. He did not care. Pure desperation makes arrogant people incredibly stupid. The notification flashed brightly on my screen. A wire transfer of $5,000 had been successfully initiated from the decoy account directly to a joint checking account owned by Matthew and Vanessa. The trap had officially snapped shut cleanly and perfectly. Oliver confirmed the transfer was complete and immediately captured all the digital footprints. The Internet Protocol addresses the timestamps and the exact routing numbers. What Matthew did not realize in his brief moment of triumphant relief was the massive legal threshold he had just blindly crossed. When he was skimming my pension over the years, he could have feigned ignorance. He could have argued in a messy civil court that he had verbal permission to use those funds for household expenses, using our shared living arrangement as a flimsy shield to avoid prison. But this new action was entirely different. He had deliberately bypassed bank security protocols to access a newly created account that he had absolutely zero legal claim to, and he had wired a large sum of money across state lines. He had just handed me undeniable and documented proof of felony wire fraud. He thought he had just bought himself another month of living like a king. He thought he had outsmarted the old man once again and proved his superiority. I thanked Oliver for his swift and brilliant work and ended the call. I leaned back in my chair, picked up my espresso, and looked out over the beautiful Italian vineyards. The morning sun was warming the stone terrace. Matthew had swallowed the hook so deeply it was sitting in his stomach, and he had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the fishing rod, ready to pull him completely under. He had taken the stolen money, and I knew exactly what Vanessa would demand they do with it next. They would not save it or pay off their debts. They would use it to throw another party to prove to their fake friends that they were still wealthy, and that would be the exact moment Oliver struck the next blow. The successful theft of the $5,000 did not trigger even a fraction of a second of guilty reflection for my son. Instead, it acted as a massive accelerant to his towering, fragile arrogance. In his deeply flawed mind, a man who abandons his bank accounts and disappears without a trace is a completely defeated man. Over the next few days, Matthew and Vanessa effortlessly convinced themselves that I was either dead in a ditch somewhere or living miserably in the rusted cab of my old pickup truck, simply too pathetic and broken to ever show my face again. They completely erased my 2 decades of blood, sweat, and absolute sacrifice from their memories. They replaced the truth with a twisted, convenient narrative where they were the ultimate, brilliant victors. They had successfully conquered the useless old man, and to the victor belonged the spoils. Any rational human being teetering on the edge of total bankruptcy would have used that $5,000 to pay the violently past due mortgage. A smart man would have paid off the maxed-out credit cards or the threatening notices from the luxury car leasing company. But Matthew and Vanessa were entirely ruled by their desperate need for social validation. Vanessa saw a golden opportunity for a grand public display of fake wealth. She was absolutely desperate to prove to her online followers and her country club rivals that the quiet rumors of their financial ruin were completely false. The damp, unfinished basement where I had slept on a military cot for 5 long years was entirely empty now. To Vanessa, that cold concrete room was not a shameful reminder of how they had abused and neglected their father. It was simply a blank canvas for her endless vanity. She immediately hired a crew of expensive, fast-working local contractors. I knew this because she bragged about it endlessly on her public social media accounts. They rushed into my former prison to install luxury vinyl plank flooring, custom-carved mahogany shelving, and expensive climate-controlled lighting systems. They were completely transforming the miserable dark corner where I used to quietly weep for my late wife into a high-end custom wine cellar. And they were funding every single nail board and light bulb with the exact money they had just committed federal wire fraud to obtain. They were literally building a monument to their own massive ego using stolen funds. I watched all of this unfold in highly detailed real time from the sunlit, peaceful terrace of my Italian villa. Oliver, acting on my strict previous instructions, had discreetly hired a premier private investigation firm back in the city. They had parked an unmarked dark gray surveillance van down the street from the house disguised as a municipal utility vehicle. They provided me with a secure, highly encrypted digital video feed straight to my laptop. I sat comfortably at my patio table drinking imported sparkling water and eating fresh olives, watching high-definition video of delivery trucks repeatedly pulling into my old driveway. They were dropping off heavy crates of imported vintage champagne, expensive floral arrangements, and gourmet catering equipment. Matthew and Vanessa were throwing a massive, lavish remodeling party to debut the new wine cellar to their social circle. It was a sickening, almost unbelievable display of blind hubris. I watched their guests arrive in leased luxury vehicles wearing designer clothes they could barely afford, completely ignorant to the horrifying fact that they were casually stepping right into a legally condemned crime scene. As the warm sun slowly set over my peaceful vineyards in Tuscany, the party back in America reached its loud, chaotic, and drunken peak. Through the hidden long-range audio recording devices, my investigators had cleverly aimed at the backyard. I listened to the sharp clinking of expensive crystal glasses. I heard the heavy upbeat bass of the lounge music echoing across the very same manicured lawn where my son had violently shoved me to the ground just a few weeks prior. Then the music suddenly faded. I heard Matthew loudly tap a silver spoon against his champagne flute, demanding the undivided attention of his 70 wealthy guests. His voice boomed confidently over the outdoor speakers, thick with expensive alcohol and completely unearned pride. He loudly toasted to new beginnings. He raised his glass and actually toasted to clearing out the useless dead weight of the past, making a cruel, thinly veiled joke about my departure. He proudly welcomed his friends to step boldly with him into a future of endless luxury and success. The crowd cheered blindly. Vanessa laughed her shrill, echoing laugh, soaking in the admiration of the people she paid so dearly to impress. That arrogant, cruel toast was the absolute final nail in his coffin. Sitting alone in the quiet Italian evening, I searched my heart for even a tiny flicker of lingering pity for the boy I had raised. There was absolutely nothing left. The boy I loved was entirely gone, replaced by a greedy, hollow shell of a man who would gladly step on his own father's neck just to look slightly taller to a crowd of strangers. I slowly closed my laptop, severing the video feed. I picked up my cell phone and sent a single heavily encrypted text message across the ocean to Oliver. The message contained only 3 words: "Burn it down." It was officially time for the second phase of our operation to begin. Matthew was standing in the exact center of his brand new custom wine cellar, surrounded by stolen luxury and fake friends, feeling like an absolute untouchable king. He had absolutely no idea that the $5,000 he used to build his little underground kingdom was heavily tracked by federal banking authorities. More importantly, he had no idea that Oliver was currently at that exact second finalizing the devastating legal paperwork that would turn that beautiful, expensive wine cellar into his absolute financial tomb. The morning after the extravagant remodeling party, I sat in my quiet Italian study and opened a secure digital file Oliver had just transmitted across the ocean. While Matthew was busy drinking imported champagne and basking in the false adoration of his guests, Oliver had been working with the cold precision of a surgeon. The file contained an absolutely flawless documentation of the wire fraud. It was a masterpiece of legal and financial tracking. Oliver did not just capture the basic transfer receipt. He had legally obtained the exact internet protocol address used to initiate the theft, linking it directly to the wireless router located inside the house. Furthermore, he had captured the unique hardware identification number of the specific laptop used for the transaction, which perfectly matched the expensive computer Matthew used for his luxury car sales. Oliver had painstakingly cross-referenced the exact time of the digital transfer with the surveillance footage from outside the property. The timestamps perfectly aligned, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Matthew was sitting in his home office actively stealing the $5,000 while the catering trucks were unloading in the driveway. There was no plausible deniability left. He could never claim that an unknown hacker had compromised the system or that Vanessa had made a mistake. The evidence was ironclad, tightly bound in a digital package ready to be handed to a federal prosecutor at a moment's notice. But simply sending him to prison right now would be far too easy, and it would leave Vanessa free to play the innocent victim. I wanted them to feel the slow, terrifying collapse of the financial walls they had so proudly built around themselves. I picked up my phone and called Oliver to initiate the next phase of the countermove. It was time to pull the most vital brick out from the foundation of their fake wealthy lifestyle. 5 years ago, when I foolishly transferred the deed of the house to Matthew, he immediately applied for a massive refinancing loan to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity. He told me he needed the money to save his business, but I later discovered he used it to fund his wedding and buy his way into the local country club. However, a struggling car salesman drowning in hidden debt does not simply walk into a bank and secure a massive equity loan. He had to lie to the underwriters. During my long, silent nights living in that damp basement, I had once stumbled upon a folder of his financial documents, left carelessly on the kitchen counter. I read through his loan application and discovered exactly how he had manipulated the bank. In order to meet the strict income requirements, Matthew had claimed my monthly pension of $2,500 as his own guaranteed rental income. He had actually forged my signature on a fake residential lease agreement, presenting me to the bank not as his father, but as a legally bound rent-paying tenant. It was a massive act of mortgage fraud committed directly against a federally insured banking institution. For years, I had kept that sickening secret buried deep inside my heart, too ashamed and broken to turn my own son into the authorities. But that grace period was officially permanently over. I instructed Oliver to draft a highly specific, legally binding notice of fraudulent income reporting. He compiled the forged lease agreement, the true pension deposit records, and the recent evidence that the so-called rental income had completely vanished. He attached undeniable proof that the original loan underwriter had been deliberately deceived regarding the borrower's true debt-to-income ratio. Oliver did not send this explosive package on the letterhead of his elite law firm. He sent it anonymously through a secure encrypted portal directly to the Central Fraud and Risk Assessment Division of the massive national bank that held Matthew's mortgage. Banks are incredibly sensitive machines, especially when it comes to million-dollar properties and suddenly vanishing assets. They do not wait for polite explanations when they suspect severe federal mortgage fraud. The moment Oliver's anonymous dossier landed on the desk of the senior risk analyst, the bank's automated self-preservation protocols immediately engaged. I sat back in my leather chair in Tuscany and listened to Oliver describe the beautiful chain reaction unfolding in real time. Because the primary mortgage loan was now officially flagged for high-level fraud investigation, the bank immediately moved to protect their remaining exposure. Within 60 minutes of receiving the dossier, they executed a sweeping automated freeze on every single line of credit attached to Matthew's Social Security number. The platinum credit cards he used to lease his sports cars were instantly suspended. The high-limit accounts Vanessa used to buy her designer clothes and fund her internet influencer lifestyle were locked down completely. The joint checking account where they had just deposited my stolen $5,000 was frozen, pending a comprehensive federal audit. They had woken up that morning with massive hangovers, complaining about the mess left by their party guests, fully believing they had secured their glamorous future. They had absolutely no idea that while they were sleeping, A silent, invisible guillotine had dropped perfectly into place. They were now completely cut off from the artificial financial oxygen they needed to survive. The next time they tried to buy a cup of coffee or put gasoline in their least luxury vehicles, the plastic cards would be ruthlessly declined. The long, painful starvation of their arrogant egos had officially begun. I received the first frantic update from Oliver just as I was finishing a plate of fresh pasta for lunch. The automated financial guillotine we had dropped the night before was finally hitting bone. The first victim of the morning was Vanessa. She had booked a full day of expensive treatments at the most exclusive luxury spa in the city center. It was a place where local celebrities and wealthy wives spent thousands of dollars to drink cucumber water and gossip in plush white robes. Vanessa had spent the last 3 years meticulously building a fake internet persona, portraying herself as a self-made luxury lifestyle guru. She often posted videos mocking people who lived on tight budgets, telling her followers that wealth was simply a mindset. On this particular morning, she was at the spa with 2 prominent local women she desperately wanted to recruit for her social media brand. She had loudly promised to treat them both to imported champagne facials and hot stone massages to prove her status. When the treatments were finished, Vanessa approached the polished marble front desk to settle the massive bill. She confidently handed the receptionist her heavy metal platinum credit card. The card was smoothly inserted into the machine. It beeped a sharp, angry tone. Declined. Vanessa laughed nervously, claiming it was just a simple bank error, and handed the young woman a second premium credit card. The machine beeped again. Declined. The receptionist, a young woman who was usually paid to be overly polite, gently informed Vanessa that the banking system was returning a severe fraud lock code. The 2 wealthy women Vanessa was trying to impress suddenly became very quiet and awkwardly stepped away from the counter, pretending to look at skincare products. Vanessa was forced to empty her designer purse, searching for cash she did not have. Ultimately, she had to leave her expensive gold watch as collateral just to escape the building, while the entire lobby watched her humiliating exit. Her carefully crafted illusion of extreme wealth shattered completely in front of the exact people she needed to impress the most. While Vanessa was fleeing the spa in hot tears, Matthew was experiencing his own personal nightmare across town. His leased imported sports car was due for a major service appointment. In his specific line of work, arriving at the luxury car dealership, driving a vehicle with an expired tag or overdue maintenance was professional suicide. He sold incredibly expensive cars to high-net-worth clients. He needed those clients and his own boss to believe he was independently wealthy, so they would trust his advice. He stood at the polished service desk wearing a tailored Italian suit, holding out his premium corporate card to pay the $2,000 maintenance fee. The service manager swiped the card. The terminal flashed bright red, indicating insufficient funds and a locked account status. Matthew immediately turned red with anger, loudly demanding they run it again. He yelled at the manager, claiming his bank account had hundreds of thousands of dollars in it. He then pulled out the debit card linked to their joint account. That was the exact account where they had deposited my stolen $5,000 just 24 hours earlier. He expected that stolen money to easily save him. The terminal rejected that card as well. The service manager looked at the computer screen and then looked at Matthew with a mixture of pity and professional disdain. He quietly informed my son that the entire banking profile had been frozen by a federal fraud division. Matthew was not allowed to take his luxury car home because the leasing company had also been notified of the severe financial flag. He had to hand over the heavy electronic keys. He was forced to walk out of the bright dealership showroom, past all of his gossiping coworkers, and wait at a public bus stop in his expensive suit. The armor of success he wore every single day had been stripped away, leaving him completely exposed. They arrived back at my old house at the exact same time, both completely panicked and demanding answers from each other. My private investigators captured the crystal-clear audio of their screaming match in the driveway. Vanessa was hysterical, accusing Matthew of spending all their money on gambling or bad investments. Matthew was furiously yelling that the bank had made a massive mistake and that he was going to sue them for ruining his professional reputation. They rushed inside and immediately logged into their online banking portal. That was when the true horror of their situation finally materialized on the glowing computer screen. Every single account balance was listed as 0. The high credit limits were completely revoked. The $5,000 they had stolen from my decoy account was not just gone, it had been officially seized as evidence of wire fraud. But the frozen money was only the beginning of the avalanche. While they were staring in absolute shock at the empty accounts, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed loudly through the house. It was a bonded courier delivering a thick, certified envelope directly from their mortgage lender. Matthew tore the envelope open with shaking hands. The letter inside was not a simple past due notice. It was a formal legal demand for an immediate comprehensive financial audit. The bank plainly stated that they had received credible documented evidence of income falsification on the original mortgage application. The letter specifically mentioned the sudden disappearance of the pension income he had claimed was his own. The bank demanded that Matthew produce 3 years of certified tax returns, authentic lease agreements, and proof of the pension income within exactly 48 hours. If he failed to provide these impossible documents, the bank would instantly accelerate the loan, demanding the entire remaining balance of $800,000 be paid in full immediately. I listened to the recording of Matthew collapsing into a dining room chair, dropping the legal letter onto the hardwood floor. The air was completely sucked out of their arrogant little kingdom. They had spent years treating me like an annoying insect they could just brush away whenever I became inconvenient. They never once stopped to realize that I was the solid concrete foundation holding their entire fragile house up. Now the foundation was entirely gone, and the heavy walls were caving in fast. They had absolutely no money to hire a lawyer to fight the bank. They had no cash to buy groceries or put gas in their remaining car. They were completely paralyzed by their own actions. And the most beautiful part of it all was that I had not spoken a single word to them since the day I left. I was thousands of miles away, tending to the rose bushes in my Italian garden, letting their own endless greed and lies do all the heavy lifting. The atmosphere inside my former home had turned incredibly toxic. The frozen bank accounts and the looming threat of the mortgage acceleration had completely shattered the delicate illusion my son and his wife had built. Through the audio surveillance my investigators had placed near the property, I listened to the raw, desperate reality of their marriage collapsing. Vanessa was no longer the confident, smiling internet personality. She was a furious, terrified woman who realized she was strapped to a sinking ship. I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy suitcases being dragged across the master bedroom floor. She was packing her designer clothes, threatening to move into a luxury hotel and bill it to her wealthy father. She screamed at Matthew, telling him that he was a complete failure and a liar. She gave him an absolute ultimatum. He had exactly 24 hours to find the cash to satisfy the bank audit, or she was walking out the front door and filing for divorce. Matthew was entirely backed into a corner of his own making. He pleaded with her, his voice cracking with sheer panic, begging for just a little more time. But time was the one currency he had completely run out of. When Vanessa slammed the bedroom door and locked him out, Matthew was left standing alone in the massive empty hallway. He had no friends he could borrow money from because he had spent years pretending he was richer than all of them. He could not go to his boss at the luxury car dealership because his professional reputation was already severely damaged by the declined corporate card. He needed a massive amount of cash immediately, and he had absolutely nowhere legitimate to turn. In his absolute desperation, his mind turned to the only person who had ever bailed him out of trouble. Me. But since he believed I was either dead or living on the streets, he decided to search for anything of value I might have left behind in the house. He remembered that before they forced me down into the damp basement, I used to keep a heavy metal lockbox in my bedroom closet. When they moved my belongings, they had callously shoved that lockbox up into the dark, suffocating heat of the attic. The surveillance cameras caught him walking to the garage to grab a heavy steel hammer. I watched him pull down the folding wooden stairs and climb up into the dusty attic. The heat up there in the middle of the summer was absolutely oppressive. It was a space filled with discarded memories and forgotten boxes. Matthew did not care about the heat or the memories. He was a starving man looking for a scrap of food. He found my old green metal lockbox pushed into a far corner under a layer of thick dust. He dragged it out into the dim light coming from the small attic window. He did not have the small brass key, so he simply raised the heavy hammer and violently smashed the lock. He hit it over and over again, the loud metallic banging echoing through the silent house until the latch finally shattered and broke away. He threw the lid open and began frantically digging through the contents. He tossed aside bundles of old letters I had written to his mother when we were young. He carelessly threw my old military service medals onto the dirty plywood floor, completely disregarding the sacred history of our family. He was only looking for one thing, and he finally found it hidden at the very bottom of the box. It was a thick, sealed manila envelope. He tore it open with his bare hands and pulled out a stack of crisp official documents. It was my whole life insurance policy. I had purchased that policy nearly 40 years ago when Matthew was just a baby. I paid the premiums every single month without fail, sacrificing my own comforts to ensure that if anything ever happened to me, my wife and my son would be financially secure. Because the policy was so old and had never been touched, it had accumulated a massive guaranteed cash value. Matthew stared at the printed numbers on the summary page, his eyes widening in the dim light. The cash surrender value of the policy was exactly $250,000. It was more than enough to pay off the bank audit, satisfy his furious wife, and keep his fake, luxurious lifestyle afloat for another year. But there was a massive legal barrier standing between his greedy fingers and that money. I was the primary policyholder and the sole owner of the account. The insurance company would never release those funds without my direct authorization and my verified signature. Matthew sat on the dusty attic floor, clutching the paper, his mind racing to find a loophole. He could not call me to ask for my signature because he had violently thrown me out, and he had absolutely no idea where I was. But his blinding desperation quickly gave way to a dark, twisted inspiration. If I was completely out of the picture, he could simply take legal control of my assets. All he needed was a convincing piece of paper to present to the insurance underwriters. He climbed down from the attic, carrying the insurance documents like a stolen treasure. He walked straight into his expensive home office and locked the door behind him. He turned on his computer and began searching the internet for legal templates. He was no longer just a struggling salesman trying to survive. He was actively deciding to cross the absolute point of no return. He spent the next 3 hours meticulously crafting a series of highly illegal, fraudulent documents. First, he downloaded a standardized, durable power of attorney form for our specific state. This document would legally grant him total control over all of my financial decisions and assets. But a power of attorney usually requires a willing participant and a notary public. Since I was not there to sign it, Matthew decided to take a much darker route. He found a template for a medical declaration of incompetence. He sat in his leather chair and typed out a completely fabricated letter, claiming to be from a prominent local neurologist. In this fake medical letter, he wrote that I had been suffering from severe, rapidly advancing dementia. He detailed completely imaginary incidents where I had supposedly become violent, confused, and ultimately wandered away from the house without a trace. He formally declared that I was legally incapacitated and unable to manage my own affairs, making him my emergency medical and financial proxy. It was a breathtakingly evil piece of fiction. He was using the very same degrading lies he had yelled at me in the backyard, claiming I was a useless old man, to build a legal trap to steal my life savings. After he finished formatting the fake medical letter, he printed the documents on thick, expensive paper. He then took a pen and pulled out one of my old birthday cards he had found in the lockbox. He sat at his desk carefully tracing the lines and loops of my handwriting. He practiced my signature dozens of times on a piece of scrap paper, learning exactly how I crossed my letters and the specific pressure I used. When he felt confident, he placed the fraudulent power of attorney document in front of him and forged my signature perfectly on the bottom line. He then forged the signature of a fake notary public and stamped it with an old expired business seal he had kept in his desk. He gathered the forged medical letter, the fake power of attorney, and the life insurance policy withdrawal request. He scanned every single page into a single digital file. He logged into the insurance company's online portal using the account number from the old documents. He uploaded the entire fraudulent package directly to the claims department. He requested an emergency expedited cash surrender wire transfer to be sent directly to his personal checking account. When the computer screen flashed a green confirmation message indicating the files had been successfully submitted, Matthew leaned back in his chair and let out a massive sigh of relief. A sick, twisted smile spread across his face. He actually believed he was a genius. He believed he had successfully navigated his way out of total destruction by outsmarting the system. He walked out of his office and knocked on the bedroom door confidently, telling Vanessa to unpack her bags because he had just solved all of their financial problems permanently. He thought the money would be quietly deposited into his account within a few business days. He thought his horrible crimes would remain forever buried inside the hard drive of his computer. He had absolutely no idea that the massive global financial umbrella corporation that managed that specific life insurance policy had recently been purchased and absorbed. He had no idea that my $20 million anonymous trust was managed by the exact same corporate entity. And most importantly, he had no idea that the moment he clicked the submit button on those forged documents, the files did not go to a random insurance underwriter. They were instantly flagged, routed, and securely forwarded directly to the private digital inbox of Oliver, my wealth management attorney. Matthew had just handed us the final devastating weapon we needed to completely destroy him. I was sitting in my study with the large wooden windows open to the warm Italian evening when the secure communication application on my laptop chimed. It was Oliver. He did not sound like a busy attorney calling with a routine legal update. He sounded like a man who had just witnessed a miracle of profound stupidity. He explained that global finance is a surprisingly small world at the highest corporate levels. The life insurance company I had used to purchase my policy 40 years ago had recently been acquired by a massive international banking conglomerate. It was the exact same global conglomerate that currently held and managed my $20 million anonymous trust. Because my name was flagged at the highest possible security clearance within their banking system as an elite ultra-high net worth client, any activity on any of my linked accounts anywhere in the world automatically triggered an immediate manual review by the senior executive fraud team. Oliver forwarded the digital file directly to my screen. I sat in the quiet comfort of my villa and stared at the horrifying documents my own son had just submitted to the underwriters. I read the fabricated medical letter claiming my mind was rapidly decaying from severe dementia. I read the disgusting fictional accounts of me wandering the streets, confused, and violently attacking my family members. I looked at the bottom of the durable power of attorney form and saw my own signature perfectly traced. Matthew had not just crossed a simple legal line to survive. He had completely obliterated every moral boundary that separated a desperate man from a total monster. He was perfectly willing to legally erase my sanity and my freedom just to keep his leased sports cars and his fake country club membership. Oliver asked me if I wanted to dispatch the federal authorities to my old house immediately to arrest him. I told him to hold his fire. We had the absolute undeniable proof of multiple major felonies securely locked in our digital vault. There was no need to rush the execution when the condemned man was still happily building his own gallows. I told Oliver to leave the insurance claim in a pending processing status, to let Matthew sweat and check his bank account every 5 minutes, expecting a massive deposit that was never going to arrive. Instead of calling the police, I opened the secure software that connected to the private investigation team stationed outside my former home. The lead investigator had recently managed to upgrade our surveillance capabilities. Under the cover of darkness, they had planted a tiny high-definition audio and video transmitter inside the decorative birdhouse hanging on the front porch, directly overlooking the large front windows of the living room. I clicked the live feed, and the screen illuminated with the chaotic scene unfolding inside my old house. The heavy velvet curtains were pulled wide open, revealing Matthew and Vanessa pacing around the living room like trapped, starving animals. The audio feed was crystal clear. The initial shock of the frozen bank accounts had completely worn off and was now replaced by vicious, venomous betrayal. Vanessa was wearing her expensive designer coat, clutching her leather purse, screaming that she was not going down with him. She was demanding to know what he had done to trigger a federal bank audit on their mortgage. Matthew, his hair completely unkempt and his expensive shirt wrinkled and stained, was yelling right back at her. The crushing pressure finally broke his resolve, and he completely lost control, confessing the dark financial secrets he had been hiding, even from his own wife. He admitted that the luxury car dealership was officially investigating him for skimming sales commissions. He confessed that the massive loan they took out to build the custom wine cellar was not their only hidden debt. He had secretly borrowed $60,000 from a dangerous, predatory private lender to cover Vanessa and her massive credit card bills from last year when she insisted on flying her friends to a luxury resort in Mexico for internet content creation. He screamed at the top of his lungs that her fake influencer lifestyle was the exact reason they were completely bankrupt and facing total ruin. Vanessa slapped him hard across the face. The sharp, cracking sound echoed through the hidden microphone. She called him a pathetic failure of a man. She yelled that she had married a successful, wealthy businessman, not a broke, desperate fraud who had to steal from his own homeless father just to buy groceries. She turned her back on him and grabbed the handle of her heavy suitcase, rolling it toward the front door. Matthew lunged forward, grabbing her arm and dropping to his knees, begging her to just wait a few more days. He frantically promised her that a massive wire transfer of $250,000 from my life insurance policy was coming to save them. In his absolute blind panic, he actually confessed to the forgery, right there on the camera feed, bragging about how he had outsmarted the insurance company and secured their luxurious future. Vanessa stopped dead in her tracks and looked down at him, not with relief, but with absolute, genuine terror. She realized in that exact moment that her husband had not just made bad financial investments. He had committed multiple severe federal crimes, and if she stayed in that house for even one more night, she would be named as a primary accomplice in a major wire fraud investigation. She ripped her arm away from his desperate grasp, leaving deep, angry scratch marks on his skin. She threw open the heavy front door and ran out into the driveway, throwing her suitcase into the back of her car and speeding off into the night. I watched Matthew stand entirely alone on the front porch, crying and screaming her name as her red taillights disappeared down the dark suburban street. He was completely isolated. He had no wife, no money, no credit cards, and absolutely no way out of the disaster he had created. The massive insurance payout he was desperately waiting for was never going to arrive to save him. He was fully primed, starving, and ready for the final trap. I picked up my phone and messaged Oliver. It was time to introduce my son to his new foreign investor. The sharp sound of heavy packing tape unrolling echoed through the cold, empty hallways of the house. Vanessa had returned early that morning, but not to forgive him. She had come back with a stack of large cardboard moving boxes and a heart completely turned to ice. She was silently and methodically packing the rest of her designer shoes and expensive handbags, absolutely determined to abandon the sinking ship before the federal authorities arrived. Matthew sat on the floor of his dark home office, staring blankly at the wall. The 48-hour deadline given by the bank for the financial audit was officially expiring today. The $250,000 insurance payout he had illegally forged my name to steal had never arrived. His laptop screen showed nothing but zero balances and threatening messages. The crushing reality of his situation was interrupted by the heavy thud of footsteps on the front porch. Matthew did not even have the energy to stand up and look out the window. He just listened as a legal process server aggressively taped a thick, bright yellow foreclosure notice directly onto the beautiful mahogany front door. The loud slapping sound of the tape was the final death knell for their fake, wealthy lifestyle. Vanessa heard it too. She walked down the sweeping staircase carrying a heavy box of clothes and looked at the yellow paper showing through the glass panes of the door. She let out a cruel, bitter laugh, told Matthew he was entirely pathetic, and turned around to grab her final suitcase. Matthew closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable sound of the front door closing forever. But instead of the door slamming, a soft, sharp chime echoed from his laptop speakers. It was a new email notification. He slowly dragged himself up from the floor and hovered his hand over the mouse, expecting another overdraft alert or a message from his angry boss. He clicked the envelope icon. The message was not from a debt collector. It was a highly professional direct correspondence from a foreign private equity firm named Tuscan Holdings. Matthew leaned closer to the glowing screen, his bloodshot eyes frantically reading the crisp, formal text. The email stated that their international investment group specialized in acquiring distressed, high-value suburban real estate directly from private owners. They claimed to have been monitoring the local property registry and had identified his specific mortgage as a prime candidate for an emergency bailout acquisition. Tuscan Holdings was offering a miraculous financial lifeline. They proposed an immediate private bridge loan that would entirely pay off his massive bank debt, satisfy the aggressive financial audit, and allow him to remain in the property. Matthew gasped, his hands trembling violently against the keyboard. It was the exact impossible miracle he had been praying for. He stumbled out of his office and screamed for Vanessa to stop packing her bags. He yelled that they were saved and begged her to just read the screen. Vanessa dropped her heavy suitcase and ran back into the room, her eyes scanning the foreign investment proposal. The bitter hatred on her face instantly melted away, replaced by the familiar sickening glow of absolute greed. They had absolutely no idea that Tuscan Holdings did not exist until a few days ago, and they certainly did not know that the sole proprietary owner of the firm was the very same old man they had thrown out into the street. They swallowed the bait whole, completely unaware of the massive steel hook waiting to tear their lives apart. The heavy silence in the living room was completely shattered by the arrival of that single email. Just moments before, Matthew and Vanessa were standing on the absolute edge of total destruction, ready to tear each other apart. Now they were huddled closely together in the dim light of the home office, staring intensely at the glowing laptop screen, as if it were a divine revelation. I knew exactly what they were reading, because I had spent 3 hours on a secure video call with Oliver, meticulously drafting every single word of that message. We designed the email to look and sound incredibly intimidating, yet entirely professional. It bore the sleek, minimalist logo of Tuscan Holdings, a supposed private equity firm based out of Milan, Italy. The message was intentionally written with a cold corporate detachment that completely masked the deeply personal trap hiding just beneath the surface. The email stated that Tuscan Holdings specialized in the aggressive acquisition of distressed, high-value residential properties across the United States. It claimed their automated algorithms had flagged his specific property because of the impending bank audit and the severe fraud lock currently placed on his mortgage. They offered a rapid bridge loan, a massive injection of $850,000 in pure liquid capital. This money would be wired directly to his original mortgage lender, completely paying off his debt in a single stroke and instantly terminating the federal financial audit that was threatening to send him to prison. To Matthew, it looked exactly like the miracle he had been desperately praying for. It looked like an escape hatch specifically designed for a man of his supposed high social standing. But Oliver is an apex predator in the financial world, and he knew exactly how to bait a hook for an arrogant luxury car salesman. The email did not ask Matthew to call a toll-free number or speak to a friendly customer service representative. Instead, it included a secure digital link to a heavily encrypted 40-page legal contract. The message clearly stated that this was a non-negotiable take-it-or-leave-it corporate offer. They had exactly 4 hours to digitally sign the agreement, or Tuscan Holdings would formally withdraw the capital and move on to their next target, leaving them to face the federal fraud investigators entirely alone. Matthew hurriedly clicked the link, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the computer mouse. The massive legal document populated on the screen filled with dense, complicated financial jargon. As he scrolled through the pages, the true brutal nature of the agreement began to reveal itself. The catch was not hidden in small print at the very bottom. It was printed in bold black letters right on the third page. In exchange for the emergency $850,000 bailout, Tuscan Holdings required absolute total collateral. The contract demanded that Matthew temporarily sign over 100% of the legal equity of the property directly to the foreign firm. Furthermore, the agreement contained a sweeping physical asset lien. This meant that every single piece of valuable property inside the house, including the custom-built wine cellar, the imported luxury furniture, Vanessa's extensive collection of designer jewelry, and the expensive appliances were all legally pledged as collateral against the loan. The terms dictated that if Matthew missed even a single monthly payment or violated any minor clause of the agreement, Tuscan Holdings would immediately take full permanent possession of the estate and all its contents without having to go through a lengthy traditional court eviction process. He would effectively become a powerless month-to-month tenant in the very home he claimed to own, forced to pay an exorbitant rental fee just to sleep under the roof. I watched the live surveillance feed from my study in Italy as Matthew leaned back in his chair, nervously running his hands through his messy hair. I could see the severe hesitation washing over his face. Deep down in the tiny remaining rational part of his brain, he knew this contract was incredibly dangerous. It was a predatory corporate death warrant. I remembered a time many years ago when I took a young Matthew to buy his very first used car. He was so blinded by the shiny paint and the leather seats that he completely ignored the catastrophic interest rate the shady salesman had printed on the paperwork. I had to physically pull the pen out of his hand and drag him off the lot to save him from financial ruin. But I was not there to pull the pen away this time. I was the one handing it to him. Vanessa was standing right behind his chair, hovering over his shoulder like a hungry vulture. She did not possess the financial literacy to understand the severe danger of the equity transfer, and she absolutely did not care. All she saw was the $850,000 bailout. She saw the immediate end to the bank audit and the magical unlocking of her frozen credit cards. She began to pressure him, her voice high-pitched and frantic. She told him that private equity firms always used aggressive contracts just to scare people. She reminded him of the horrible humiliation she had suffered at the luxury spa and told him that if he did not sign the paper right now, she was walking out the door and calling a divorce lawyer. She expertly manipulated his deepest insecurities, calling him a coward and a failure until his fragile ego completely snapped. Matthew tried to rationalize the massive risk using his own twisted car salesman logic. I listened through the hidden microphone as he proudly explained his brilliant strategy to Vanessa. He confidently told her that foreign investors were completely disconnected from local American real estate laws. He believed they were just a faceless corporation sitting behind desks in Italy, who would never actually cross the ocean to check on a single suburban house. He convinced himself that as soon as Tuscan Holdings paid off his original bank loan and the federal fraud investigation was officially closed, he would just find a shady local private lender to refinance the house again. He actually thought he could use the new loan to pay off the foreign firm and steal the equity right back. He genuinely believed he was a financial genius manipulating a billion-dollar international conglomerate. His blind hubris was absolutely intoxicating to watch. He did not read the remaining 37 pages of the contract. He completely skipped over the ironclad clauses Oliver had specifically inserted, which waived his right to a trial and granted the primary shareholder of Tuscan Holdings the right to physical entry at any given time. Matthew simply scrolled all the way down to the final page. He clicked the empty digital signature box. He typed his full legal name using the keyboard, and then he clicked the large green button labeled Execute Agreement. Thousands of miles away, sitting on my quiet sunlit terrace, my secure encrypted laptop let out a soft, satisfying chime. A notification flashed across my screen confirming that the digital documents had been successfully received and fully authenticated. I opened the file and stared at his electronic signature stamped boldly at the bottom of the page. I felt a cold, heavy knot of absolute finality settle deep in my stomach. The trap had officially sprung shut, and the heavy steel doors were permanently locked. I immediately forwarded the signed contract to Oliver. Within minutes, he initiated the massive wire transfer from my anonymous lottery trust. $850,000 of my own newly acquired wealth was securely sent directly to Matthew's original mortgage lender, completely paying off the debt and instantly silencing the aggressive bank auditors. On paper, Matthew and Vanessa were suddenly completely debt-free. Their frozen bank accounts would be unlocked by the next morning. They were going to wake up feeling like absolute conquerors, completely unaware that they had just willingly sold their entire lives, their home, and their remaining dignity to the very same useless old man they had violently thrown into the street. They no longer owned a single blade of grass on that property. They belonged entirely to me. The morning after my son signed his entire life away, the heavy dark clouds that had been hanging over my old house completely vanished. Through the digital monitoring systems Oliver had set up, I watched the exact moment the massive wire transfer cleared the international banking hurdles and landed directly in the accounts of the primary mortgage lender. The automated federal fraud lock that had paralyzed Matthew and Vanessa was immediately lifted. When Matthew logged into his online banking portal, the terrifying red numbers that had haunted him for 2 days were gone. The original mortgage balance of $800,000 was completely wiped clean. The bank audit was officially canceled. And because the predatory bridge loan he had blindly signed was for $850,000, he suddenly found a leftover balance of exactly $50,000 resting cheerfully in his primary checking account. I listened through the hidden patio microphone as a wave of absolute hysterical relief washed over the house. The sound of heavy suitcases rolling across the hardwood floor stopped completely. Vanessa, who just hours before had been violently cursing his name and threatening divorce, was suddenly laughing. It was a loud, piercing laugh filled with toxic triumph. I watched the live video feed as she threw her arms around his neck, praising his absolute brilliance. They did not sit down at the kitchen table to carefully read the 40-page contract they had just legally bound themselves to. They did not discuss how they were going to manage the exorbitant monthly interest payments required by Tuscan Holdings. Instead, they immediately began to mock the nameless, faceless foreign investors they believed they had just successfully conned. Matthew strutted around the living room with a fresh glass of expensive bourbon, boasting about how easy it was to outsmart a massive European financial firm. He proudly told Vanessa that the Italian executives were complete fools for handing over almost $1 million without even sending an inspector to walk the property. He genuinely believed his slick salesman charm had translated perfectly through a digital signature box. He thought he was the ultimate predator in the financial food chain, having successfully scammed a naive foreign corporation out of pure liquid cash. He completely ignored the reality that he had just handed over the total legal equity and physical ownership of his home to a man who knew every single hidden crack in the foundation. This blinding, suffocating hubris was not a new development. As I sat in my quiet study halfway across the world, watching him celebrate his own doom, I thought back to the day he graduated from high school. He had taken the reliable, sensible sedan I bought him for graduation and recklessly raced it down a wet suburban road, completely totaling the vehicle. When the police arrived, he did not take responsibility. He lied and blamed the wet pavement. I was the one who paid the massive insurance deductible. I was the one who bought him a replacement car so he could get to his college classes. I had spent his entire life stepping in front of the consequences of his terrible actions, absorbing the impact so he would never have to feel the pain. My endless parental protection had slowly mutated into his ultimate weakness. I had built a monster who firmly believed he was entirely immune to failure. But today, there was no safety net waiting to catch him. The $50,000 of leftover loan money was burning a massive hole in their pockets. Any rational adult who had just barely escaped federal prison and total bankruptcy would have hidden that money away for absolute emergencies. But rationality had completely evacuated the premises. Vanessa immediately grabbed her freshly unlocked platinum credit cards and announced that they needed to show the entire neighborhood that they were completely untouchable. She refused to be seen as a failure by the wealthy country club women who had witnessed her humiliating credit card decline at the luxury spa just 2 days prior. She demanded a massive public spectacle to instantly repair their damaged social standing. Within exactly 2 hours of the bank accounts thawing, Matthew was already standing in the gleaming showroom of the luxury car dealership. He did not walk in with the quiet humility of a man who had been forced to take the public bus the day before. He kicked open the heavy glass doors, wearing his most expensive tailored suit, projecting an aura of absolute supreme arrogance. My private investigators tracked his every move, seamlessly blending into the dealership lobby to record the interaction. Matthew loudly approached the service manager who had previously confiscated his leased vehicle. He did not ask for his old car back. He demanded to see the newest, most expensive imported sports car on the showroom floor. When the general manager tried to quietly bring up the severe financial hold from the previous day, Matthew practically threw his debit card onto the polished glass desk. He loudly proclaimed that he had just closed a massive international real estate deal and that his temporary banking issue was nothing more than a pathetic clerical error. He used the leftover $50,000 from the Tuscan Holdings loan to put a massive cash down payment on a brand new convertible sports car. He signed the exorbitant lease agreement without even blinking, completely oblivious to the fact that his new aggressive loan contract with my company explicitly stated that any new major asset purchases were immediately subject to our total collateral lien. He thought he was buying a status symbol, but he was actually just buying me a brand new car using my own money. While Matthew was recklessly burning through cash at the dealership, Vanessa was busy transforming my former home into a circus of absolute vanity. She sat by the swimming pool, scrolling through her phone, hiring the most expensive event planners, florists, and gourmet catering companies in the city. She was planning what she loudly referred to on her public social media accounts as a "We Survived" gala. She posted a long, highly fabricated video to her thousands of followers, claiming that she and her husband had recently been targeted by jealous financial hackers. She spun a ridiculous, glamorous story about how their superior business acumen and deep elite connections had allowed them to conquer the adversity. She announced that they were throwing the party of the century to celebrate their massive success and to officially debut the custom-built wine cellar in the basement. I watched the delivery trucks begin to arrive at the house yet again. They unloaded towering arrangements of exotic white orchids, massive velvet lounge chairs, and endless crates of imported champagne. Vanessa was walking around the property, giving orders to the landscaping crew, treating them with the exact same condescending cruelty she used to direct at me. She pointed at the mahogany front door, demanding they polish the brass fixtures until they shined perfectly. She was meticulously decorating a house that no longer belonged to her. She was spending money that she would inevitably have to pay back with astronomical interest. The tragic irony of the situation was absolutely beautiful in its execution. Every single dollar they spent on the extravagant party was secretly enhancing the overall value of the property I now completely owned. Every expensive bottle of wine they stacked in the basement cellar was legally my property the moment it crossed the threshold of the house. They were happily and voluntarily trapping themselves inside a golden cage of their own design. As the sun began to set over the rolling hills of Italy, I poured myself a small glass of red wine and called Oliver for our daily briefing. He confirmed that the property deed had been successfully and completely transferred into the holding accounts of our corporate shell company. The local county records had been quietly updated. Matthew Vance was no longer the legal owner of the estate. He was now officially a severely delinquent tenant who had already violated 6 different major clauses of his commercial lease agreement by purchasing the sports car and making unauthorized luxury alterations to the property. Oliver asked me if I wanted to dispatch the local sheriff to serve the immediate eviction notice and end the game. I took a slow sip of my wine and looked at the live video feed showing Vanessa happily hanging expensive crystal string lights across the back patio. I told Oliver that serving a quiet piece of paper on a random Tuesday morning was far too merciful for people who had violently shoved an old man to the ground in front of 50 guests. They wanted a massive audience to witness their fake glorious triumph. They had invited over 70 wealthy, influential people to come and worship their manufactured success. I decided it was only fair to give them exactly what they wanted. I instructed Oliver to prepare the final legal eviction documents, the undeniable proof of the bank fraud, and the complete financial ownership records. I told him to hire 2 highly intimidating private security contractors. I then opened my laptop and booked a private charter jet to fly me directly back to the United States. I was going to let them put on their beautiful, expensive dresses and their tailored suits. I was going to let them drink their champagne and give their arrogant speeches. And right when they felt completely untouchable, I was going to walk through the front doors of my own house and burn their entire world to the ground in front of every single person they were trying to impress. The final reckoning was approaching fast, and I was bringing absolute hell with me. I sat in the quiet morning light of my Italian study and opened the encrypted communication channel with Oliver. The digital signature Matthew had frantically applied to the Tuscan Holdings contract was now permanently locked into the global registry. I told Oliver it was time to turn the key. Oliver did not send an email or make a polite phone call to my son. He executed the contract clauses with the absolute cold precision of a military strike. He electronically filed the massive physical asset lien with the local county clerk, making it a matter of undeniable public record. The beautiful, sprawling estate that I had built with my own hands was no longer a family home. It was now legally classified as a fully surrendered corporate asset. Every single piece of custom furniture, every imported appliance, Vanessa's expensive designer jewelry, and every bottle of expensive champagne sitting in their newly built basement wine cellar was now the sole protected property of my holding company. People might wonder why a father would design such a ruthless, inescapable legal trap for his own flesh and blood. The answer was rooted deep in a painful, bitter memory from exactly 10 years ago. Back then, Matthew had begged me with tears in his eyes to co-sign a commercial lease for a small retail storefront. He swore to me and his late mother that he was finally going to settle down and open a legitimate auto detailing business. I trusted him unconditionally and signed my name on the dotted line. 3 months later, I received a terrifying call from the property landlord. Matthew had never opened the business. He had secretly turned the space into an illegal high-stakes gambling room. When the dangerous debt collectors inevitably came looking for him, he simply abandoned the property in the middle of the night, leaving me completely legally responsible for tens of thousands of dollars in property damages and unpaid rent. I had to empty my modest retirement savings and work double shifts at the construction site, just to keep myself out of a jail cell, while he completely ignored my desperate phone calls for 6 agonizing months. He had always used physical distance and exhausting legal loopholes to escape his responsibilities while leaving me to bleed. That was exactly why Oliver and I had carefully engineered this specific contract to have absolutely 0 loopholes and 0 distance. The true lethal power of the Tuscan Holdings agreement was not just the exorbitant daily interest rate or the complete forced transfer of their home equity. The absolute legal masterpiece of the contract, the poisonous dagger that Matthew had completely failed to see, was deeply buried in Section 4, Paragraph 2. It was a highly specialized corporate clause designed entirely to bypass the long, agonizing months of a traditional American residential eviction process. The contract explicitly stated that upon the immediate execution of the agreement, the primary shareholder of the holding company was granted total, absolute, and immediate right to physical possession of the entire property. Because Matthew was so desperate to secure the massive bailout money, to save his fake influencer wife, he had blindly signed a commercial asset surrender rather than a standard residential loan modification. He had voluntarily and permanently waived his legal rights as a protected homeowner. He had legally reduced himself and Vanessa to the humiliating status of unauthorized commercial trespassers the very second the foreign funds hit the bank. The contract dictated that if Tuscan Holdings demanded the keys, he was legally required to vacate the premises instantly. There would be no mandatory 30-day written notice. There would be no lengthy, sympathetic court hearing in front of a judge. There would be absolutely no legal right to appeal the decision. He had essentially handed me the supreme legal authority to walk right through the front door of my own house and throw him out onto the cold concrete street with the exact same ruthless, blinding speed he had used against me during his backyard barbecue. While I was reviewing these finalized documents on my computer screen, my private investigators were feeding me live audio of Vanessa happily directing the gourmet catering company in my backyard. She was busy deciding whether to serve the expensive caviar on silver platters or crystal trays, completely oblivious to the fact that she no longer legally owned the platters, the trays, or the grass she was standing on. They were gleefully planning a massive victory celebration inside a giant steel bear trap that had already snapped completely shut around their ankles. Oliver confirmed that his paralegal team had successfully delivered the certified corporate documents directly to the local county sheriff department. The authorities were fully briefed and legally bound to enforce the commercial property rights of Tuscan Holdings at a moment's notice. The local police were no longer there to protect Matthew from his creditors. They were now actively waiting on standby to protect my corporate assets from Matthew. I thanked Oliver for his absolute brilliance and closed my laptop. I stood up and walked over to the large antique wooden wardrobe in my sunlit bedroom. I reached past my comfortable casual linen shirts and pulled out a heavy, dark, bespoke suit I had recently purchased from a master tailor in Milan. I carefully packed a small black leather travel bag. I was no longer the broken, bleeding old man quietly dragging a canvas duffel bag out of a damp, miserable basement. I was the primary shareholder. I was the landlord. And I was coming home to collect my rent. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the lush Tuscan hills when my private driver pulled the sleek black car up to the stone steps of the villa. I did not look back at the beautiful property as I climbed into the soft leather back seat. My reflection in the tinted window caught me completely by surprise for a brief passing moment. I was no longer the exhausted retired construction worker wearing faded flannel shirts and scuffed heavy work boots. I was dressed completely differently, in a dark charcoal custom-tailored Italian suit, woven from the absolute finest silk and wool blend available. It fit my frame perfectly, hiding the fading yellow bruises on my ribs and projecting an aura of absolute uncompromising authority. I adjusted the crisp cuffs of my white dress shirt, feeling the cold, heavy weight of a platinum watch resting against my wrist. This was the expensive, impenetrable armor of a man who completely owned the battlefield. We arrived at the private aviation terminal just outside the city, where a sleek white charter jet was waiting on the tarmac with its engines already humming a low, powerful note. The flight attendant greeted me respectfully by my last name and handed me a glass of aged scotch as I settled comfortably into the oversized leather captain chair. As the jet smoothly accelerated down the runway and lifted effortlessly into the darkening sky, I opened my laptop one final time to check the live surveillance feed from back home. The contrast between our two worlds was absolutely striking. I was soaring 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by silent, absolute luxury, while my former house was overflowing with chaotic, desperate noise. Vanessa was running frantically around the backyard, adjusting expensive floral arrangements and loudly screaming at the hired catering staff. Matthew was standing proudly by the swimming pool, drinking champagne and accepting premature congratulations from his fake wealthy friends. They were completely intoxicated by the glamorous illusion of their own massive success. I closed the laptop screen and took a slow, satisfying sip of the burning scotch. The flight to the United States would take several hours, giving the evening shadows plenty of time to stretch across my old suburban lawn. They had planned their massive gala to reach its peak right around sunset to ensure the custom lighting in their newly stolen wine cellar looked absolutely perfect for her internet videos. It was a flawless timeline. They were meticulously setting the grand stage for their own spectacular public execution. The quiet game of digital shadows and anonymous corporate letters was officially over. I leaned my head back against the soft leather headrest and watched the dark clouds part outside the small oval window. I was coming back to the exact place where my son had violently thrown me out into the dirt, calling me a useless parasite. But this time I was not bringing a fatherly lecture or a tearful plea for forgiveness. I was bringing the absolute crushing weight of the law, and the target was definitively locked. The warm evening air surrounding my former property was thick with the scent of expensive catered food and imported floral arrangements. My private town car pulled quietly to a stop at the very end of the long, dark street, remaining entirely out of sight. I stepped out of the vehicle and told the driver to wait. The night was perfectly clear, and the massive custom lighting system Vanessa had rented was casting a bright golden glow across the entire manicured backyard. I walked slowly up the familiar paved driveway, my leather shoes making absolutely no sound. As I approached the heavy wooden side gate, I could hear the upbeat classical music being played by a live string quartet she had hired to entertain the crowd. I stood in the deep shadows of a large oak tree I had planted decades ago and watched the spectacular circus of lies unfolding on my own lawn. There were at least 70 wealthy guests gathered around the glowing blue waters of the swimming pool. They were the exact type of shallow, influential country club members Vanessa had spent the last 5 years desperately trying to impress. The men were wearing expensive tailored jackets, and the women were draped in designer silk dresses and heavy diamond jewelry. They were laughing, holding delicate crystal glasses filled with the expensive vintage champagne Matthew had recklessly purchased just hours earlier. Waiters dressed in pristine white coats were smoothly circulating through the massive crowd, carrying silver platters loaded with gourmet appetizers. It was a flawless picture of absolute high society success. It was also a complete and total criminal illusion. Every single person standing in that backyard was an unwitting accessory to a massive financial fraud. They were casually drinking wine that legally belonged to my corporate holding company. They were walking across a meticulously cut lawn that was officially surrendered commercial property. And the arrogant couple they were all there to celebrate were nothing more than highly delinquent trespassers who were about to be forcefully evicted. But the guests had absolutely no idea. They were completely mesmerized by the fake, glamorous narrative my son and his wife were spinning. Before the speech began, Matthew had been circulating through the crowd, shaking hands and patting men on the back. He was loudly bragging about the new sports car he had leased that very morning. He told the local bank manager, the exact same man who had witnessed him push me to the ground 2 weeks prior, that the new car was just a small reward for closing a massive international real estate deal. He was casually spending the leftover $50,000 in his mind, buying expensive watches and planning luxurious vacations to Europe to supposedly meet his new investors. He was so deeply submerged in his own blinding delusion that he could not see the massive legal avalanche hanging directly over his head. The upbeat string music slowly faded away. A sudden hush fell over the large crowd as Vanessa confidently stepped up to a small wooden podium positioned perfectly at the edge of the patio. She tapped the silver microphone twice, sending a soft, echoing thud through the tall outdoor speakers. She was wearing a stunning dark red evening gown that probably cost more than my first car. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was flawless. She looked exactly like the wealthy, successful internet lifestyle guru she pretended to be online. Matthew stepped up right beside her, standing tall and puffing out his chest. He was holding a heavy glass of bourbon, smiling out at the crowd with a sickening expression of total, supreme arrogance. Vanessa leaned into the microphone and began to deliver the most breathtakingly arrogant speech I had ever heard in my entire life. She did not start by thanking her guests for coming. She started by talking about the heavy burdens of massive success. She told the captivated crowd that she and Matthew had recently been the victims of a highly sophisticated cyber attack. She lied flawlessly, explaining that jealous corporate competitors had tried to illegally freeze their banking assets to destroy their thriving business ventures. She spoke with a fake, trembling emotion in her voice, describing the terrible stress of the past few days. She painted herself and my son as brave, visionary entrepreneurs who had to fight a brutal, invisible war to protect their massive wealth. The wealthy guests were completely silent, hanging on to every single word of her fabricated tragedy. Then Vanessa's voice shifted from fake sorrow to loud, triumphant pride. She announced that they had not only defeated the hackers, but they had used their brilliant business acumen to secure a massive injection of foreign investment capital. She proudly spoke the name Tuscan Holdings into the microphone, letting the fake Italian corporate name roll off her tongue to impress the crowd. She told her friends that this elite European private equity firm had recognized their absolute genius and had personally stepped in to completely pay off their local mortgages and elevate their brand to an international level. Matthew nodded solemnly, beside her, raising his glass in a gesture of fake, humble agreement. He actually believed the words she was saying. He had completely erased the memory of his pathetic tears and his massive forgery from his mind. He truly believed he was a master negotiator who had successfully outsmarted a billion-dollar global conglomerate. He felt like an untouchable king standing on the balcony of his castle looking down at his loyal subjects. When Vanessa began speaking about the new wine cellar, she pointed gracefully toward the open doors leading down into the basement. She proudly announced that the custom mahogany shelving and the climate control systems were the physical manifestation of their new elevated lifestyle. She called it a sanctuary for fine taste and elite gatherings. She completely failed to mention that the sanctuary was built inside the exact same damp concrete room where she had forced her elderly father-in-law to sleep on a narrow cot for 5 miserable years. She invited all the guests to take a private tour of the cellar after the speech to admire her brilliant interior design skills. She was inviting them to admire a room that I legally owned filled with expensive wine that was legally mine. Vanessa concluded her speech by making a thinly veiled, completely cruel joke about finally clearing out the useless dead weight from their lives. She did not say my name, but the message was perfectly clear to the people who knew about my sudden departure. She was framing my absolute sacrifice and my quiet exit as a necessary purge that allowed them to finally reach their true elite potential. The crowd erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause. They raised their crystal champagne glasses high into the air, cheering for the victorious couple. Vanessa smiled brightly, soaking in the fake adoration like a plant absorbing sunlight. Matthew stepped forward and kissed her cheek, playing the role of the devoted, successful husband perfectly. They were standing at the absolute peak of their imaginary mountain. They had everything they ever wanted: the money, the house, the perfect public image, and the total admiration of their peers. I stood in the dark shadows watching the crowd applaud for a few more seconds. I felt the heavy, smooth fabric of my Italian suit and adjusted the cuffs of my pristine white shirt. I took a deep, slow breath of the warm evening air, letting the absolute finality of the moment wash over my mind. They had built their towering, beautiful castle entirely out of stolen cards, and it was finally time to introduce the hurricane. I stepped out from the shadows of the oak tree and began walking slowly toward the bright lights of the patio. The heavy mahogany front doors of my former home were not locked. I reached out and pushed them open. The polished brass hinges made absolutely no sound as I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the grand foyer. The air conditioning was running high, chilling the sweat on my neck. I was not alone. Oliver walked calmly right beside me, holding a thick black leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of my son. Flanking us on either side were 2 highly trained private security contractors. They were massive, intimidating men, dressed in completely dark tactical suits with official enforcement badges clipped securely to their belts. We did not sneak in through the back gate. We walked straight through the center of the house, our heavy leather shoes echoing sharply against the hardwood floors Vanessa had just paid to have polished. The vibrant, chaotic noise of the backyard party flowed through the open, sliding glass doors. I could hear the lively string quartet playing a joyful classical melody, and the loud overlapping voices of 70 wealthy guests celebrating a massive lie. We stepped out onto the expansive stone patio. The bright custom lighting momentarily blinded me, but I kept my posture completely rigid and my head held high. The first few guests standing near the doorway turned around with their crystal champagne glasses half raised to their lips. The smiles on their faces instantly evaporated. They did not recognize me at first. The last time they saw me, I was a bleeding, pathetic old man, wearing a faded flannel shirt kneeling in the dirt. Now they were staring at a formidable corporate executive wearing a flawless, imported Italian suit, standing shoulder to shoulder with armed men. The sudden, chilling silence began at the back of the crowd and quickly rippled forward like a dark, heavy wave crashing over the patio. The wealthy men and women stopped talking and took involuntary steps backward, parting like the Red Sea to create a wide, clear path between me and the swimming pool. The string quartet noticed the sudden, eerie quiet and abruptly stopped playing mid-note. The only sound left in the entire sprawling backyard was the gentle splashing of the illuminated pool water and the slow, deliberate crunch of my expensive shoes walking across the stone patio. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the wooden podium at the far end of the yard. Matthew and Vanessa were still standing there. Vanessa's bright, triumphant smile was completely frozen on her face. Her eyes darted wildly from the armed security guards to the sharp cut of my suit, and finally up to my face. The sheer cognitive dissonance was breaking her mind. She could not comprehend how the useless parasite she had thrown away was suddenly standing before her, radiating absolute wealth and terrifying power. Matthew stood right next to her, completely paralyzed. The heavy glass of bourbon in his hand began to tremble violently, sloshing the amber liquid over the rim and onto his expensive tailored pants. He stared at me with his mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the terrifying reality standing on his patio. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody breathed. The 70 guests looked back and forth between the arrogant couple at the podium and the intimidating squad of men blocking the only exit. Then my son's deeply ingrained survival mechanism finally kicked in. It was not a mechanism built on logic or truth. It was built entirely on blind, desperate denial. He could not afford to look weak in front of the local bank manager and the country club elite. He had just spent 20 minutes convincing them he was an untouchable international businessman. He desperately tried to force reality to bend back to his fabricated narrative. Matthew let out a loud, sharp laugh that echoed awkwardly across the silent yard. It was a terrible, nervous sound, completely devoid of genuine humor. He pointed a shaking finger at me and looked out at his wealthy friends. He loudly declared that his poor, elderly father had clearly lost his mind. He yelled to the crowd that I was a confused, homeless old man who had probably wandered away from a public shelter and somehow managed to steal a nice suit. He tried to project an air of sympathetic annoyance, pretending that my arrival was just a sad, pathetic interruption to his glorious evening. He turned toward the edge of the patio, where Vanessa had stationed 2 young hired bouncers dressed in cheap black polo shirts. Matthew aggressively barked orders at them. He demanded that they immediately grab the trespassing old man and drag him out to the curb. He yelled that he was not going to let a crazy homeless person ruin the most important night of his entire life. He pointed at my private security contractors and confidently told his hired bouncers that those men were probably just fake actors I had paid a few dollars to stand next to me. He was loudly digging his own grave in front of the exact people he was trying to impress. The 2 young bouncers hesitated. They looked at the massive, heavily armed tactical contractors standing perfectly still beside me. They looked at the cold, dead expression on Oliver's face. They were paid $20 an hour to check guest invitations, not to engage in a physical altercation with high-level private security. They wisely took a step back and lowered their hands completely, refusing my son's frantic orders. Matthew realized his hired muscle was entirely useless. The fake, nervous smile finally collapsed from his face, replaced by a raw, desperate panic. He stepped away from the podium and started walking aggressively toward me, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He yelled my name, completely dropping the sympathetic act and reverting right back to the cruel, aggressive bully he truly was. He demanded to know what I was doing in his house. He screamed that I was trespassing on private property and that he was going to call the real police to have me thrown in a jail cell for the rest of my miserable life. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply stood my ground in the warm evening air, waiting for him to close the distance. I let him scream. I let him threaten me. I let every single person in that backyard witness his absolute cruelty, because it was the perfect prologue to the devastating truth I was about to unleash. Matthew was standing just a few feet away from me, his face bright red and his chest heaving as he screamed empty threats into the cool night air. He yelled that he was calling the police to have me arrested for criminal trespassing. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic energy. I simply turned my head slightly and gave Oliver a subtle nod. Oliver stepped smoothly out from behind my shoulder, completely ignoring Matthew's aggressive posturing. He unclasped his black leather briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of finalized legal documents, and pressed them firmly directly against my son's chest. Matthew instinctively grabbed the heavy papers to keep them from falling to the stone patio. He looked down at the bold black letters printed across the top page. It was the finalized, executed commercial contract for Tuscan Holdings, the exact same document he had blindly signed earlier that morning. While Matthew was staring down at his own digital signature in absolute confusion, I walked right past him. I stepped up to the wooden podium where Vanessa was still standing, frozen like a pale marble statue. She was trembling so violently that the silver microphone in her hand was rattling against the wooden stand. I did not say a single word to her. I simply reached out and gently took the microphone from her cold fingers. She let it go without a fight, completely terrified by the heavy presence of the armed security contractors standing at the edge of the patio. I turned around to face the massive crowd of 70 wealthy guests. The entire backyard was so quiet, I could hear the gentle rustling of the wind through the oak trees. I spoke into the microphone, my voice deep and completely steady, echoing powerfully across the glowing swimming pool. I thanked Vanessa for her incredibly imaginative speech. I told the crowd that it was truly a beautiful story about overcoming adversity and securing international investment. Then I looked directly at the local bank manager standing in the front row and delivered the absolute crushing truth. I formally introduced myself not as the useless, homeless father they had been told about, but as the sole proprietary owner and primary shareholder of Tuscan Holdings. The collective gasp from the wealthy crowd was incredibly loud. I saw the exact moment the devastating reality crashed into Matthew's mind. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. The foreign billionaire he thought he had brilliantly scammed was actually the very same man he had banished to a damp basement. But a verbal revelation was not enough for the magnitude of their crimes. They needed a public, undeniable reckoning. Vanessa had rented a massive high-definition laser projector to display her internet influencer videos against the large, flat white stucco wall of the house. Oliver smoothly walked over to the audiovisual table, bypassed her hired technicians, and plugged his secure encrypted tablet directly into the main projection system. I announced to the crowd that I wanted to show them exactly how my son and his wife had managed to secure their luxurious lifestyle. The bright laser projector clicked on instantly, illuminating the entire back wall of the house into a massive 2-story movie screen. The first image Oliver projected was the crystal-clear banking log showing the exact internet protocol address and hardware identification of Matthew's laptop. I explained into the microphone that just 2 days ago my son had intentionally bypassed federal banking security protocols to steal $5,000 from my retirement account just to fund the construction of his new wine cellar. The crowd murmured in absolute shock. Wealthy people do not tolerate thieves, especially those who steal from their own family. Before Matthew could even open his mouth to scream a denial, Oliver switched the image on the massive wall. This was the masterstroke. The screen filled with the medical declaration of incompetence and the durable power of attorney forms. The forged signature of my name was magnified to 10 feet tall for every single guest to analyze. I read the disgusting fabricated medical letter out loud over the speakers. I read the parts where Matthew claimed I was suffering from severe violent dementia and wandering the streets completely lost. I told the horrified crowd that my son had meticulously forged these documents and submitted them to a global financial institution, attempting to illegally cash out my $250,000 life insurance policy. The reaction from this crowd was absolute visceral disgust. The women in designer dresses who had just been cheering for Vanessa were now looking at her with pure, unadulterated revulsion. The men were shaking their heads, backing completely away from the patio, as if Matthew was carrying a highly contagious disease. Vanessa covered her face with her hands, sobbing loudly, and trying to hide from the blinding light of the projector. She was completely ruined in the eyes of the only society she ever cared about. Her fake internet empire and her hollow social standing evaporated in a matter of seconds. For the final killing blow, Oliver projected the last document onto the side of the house. It was the executed deed transfer and the commercial asset lien from Tuscan Holdings. I looked at Matthew, who was now on his knees on the stone patio clutching the physical papers to his chest, weeping uncontrollably. I spoke into the microphone one last time, making sure every single word was permanently etched into his memory. I told him that by signing that bailout loan, he had voluntarily and legally surrendered 100% of the property equity directly to my corporation. I explained that the house, the custom wine cellar, the imported furniture, and the brand new sports car sitting in the driveway no longer belonged to him. The absolute masterstroke was completely finished. The truth was violently dragged out into the bright light, and their fake towering kingdom had been reduced to a pile of worthless ashes. The massive glowing images of the forged documents slowly faded from the side of the house, leaving the backyard bathed only in the cold, silent light of the swimming pool. I looked down at Matthew, who was still kneeling on the rough stone patio. He was grasping at the legs of my trousers, begging me to stop crying, that he was my only son, and that I could not do this to my own family. But his tears were entirely hollow. He was not crying because he felt remorse for the horrible things he had done to me. He was only crying because he had finally been caught, and his entire fake world was collapsing in front of an audience. I gently but firmly pulled my leg away from his desperate grip. I looked at the crowd of wealthy guests who were now rapidly moving toward the side gate, eager to distance themselves from the catastrophic crime scene. I turned my attention back to Matthew and Vanessa. Vanessa was huddled near the wooden podium, her mascara running down her face, completely ruining her perfect internet image forever. I leaned forward slightly and looked directly into my son's terrified eyes. I did not yell. I did not have to raise my voice to project absolute power. I spoke the exact same words he had screamed at me just a few weeks ago on this very same patio. I told him to get out of my house. I told him he was nobody. I watched those words strike him physically, like a heavy blow to the chest. He knew the absolute finality in my voice. There was no negotiation left. There was no fatherly forgiveness waiting at the end of the night. I stepped back and pulled my pocket watch from my tailored suit jacket. I announced to them both that they had exactly 10 minutes to leave the property forever. I explicitly ordered them to leave with absolutely nothing but the clothes currently on their backs. They were not allowed to pack a suitcase. They were not allowed to take the expensive jewelry, the designer shoes, or the keys to the leased luxury cars sitting in the driveway. Every single physical item on that property was legally seized as corporate collateral, and attempting to remove anything would be classified as grand larceny. Matthew tried to argue, claiming he had absolutely nowhere to go in the middle of the night. Oliver stepped forward, and calmly pointed toward the long, dark driveway. At that exact moment, the heavy flashing red and blue lights of 3 local police cruisers silently illuminated the front of the estate. Oliver informed them that the officers were waiting at the curb. If Matthew and Vanessa were still standing on my property, when the 10 minutes expired, Oliver would personally hand the federal wire fraud and forgery dossiers directly to the police, and they would leave the neighborhood in metal handcuffs. I snapped the pocket watch closed, and the sharp metallic click echoed across the empty patio. I told them the clock was officially ticking. The 10 minutes ticked by in absolute agonizing silence. The wealthy, influential guests had completely vanished into the night, leaving behind half-empty crystal champagne glasses and expensive plates of catered food sitting abandoned on the stone patio. The hired string quartet had packed their wooden instruments and fled out the back gate the moment they saw the police lights flashing against the trees. Matthew and Vanessa were entirely alone, standing in the bright, glowing ruins of their carefully manufactured empire. When Oliver calmly pointed his finger toward the heavy police cruisers waiting at the very end of the driveway, the final remaining shreds of Vanessa's loyalty instantly evaporated into the cool evening air. She turned to face my son with a level of vicious, terrifying cruelty that even I had never witnessed before. She did not shed a single sympathetic tear for him. She looked at his pale, sweating face with pure, unadulterated hatred. She screamed that he was a pathetic, worthless liar who had maliciously dragged her down into the absolute gutter. She yelled at the top of her lungs that she had wasted the best years of her youth, pretending he was a highly successful businessman when he was actually nothing more than a desperate, bumbling criminal. Matthew reached out a trembling hand, trying to grasp her arm desperately, begging her to stay and figure a way out of this terrifying nightmare together. He promised he could fix it. She violently slapped his hand away, leaving bright red marks across his knuckles. She coldly told him there was no together anymore, and there never would be again. She told him he was inevitably going to a federal penitentiary, and she absolutely refused to be wearing a matching orange jumpsuit when the judge slammed the gavel down. She turned on the heel of her expensive designer shoes, marched right past the heavily armed security contractors, and walked briskly down the long paved driveway. She did not look back even once as she hailed a passing taxi and disappeared into the dark suburban night, completely abandoning him to the wolves he had invited to their door. Matthew was left entirely alone, standing on the cold stone patio of a massive estate he no longer legally owned. The 10-minute deadline officially expired. Oliver stepped forward looking at his watch and calmly informed him that his time was completely up. The 2 massive private security contractors moved in, grabbing my son firmly by the shoulders of his tailored Italian jacket and physically escorting him out of the glowing backyard. They marched him down the side gravel path and out to the front curb, where the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers were violently cutting through the dark night. I followed closely behind them, holding the thick, heavy legal dossier containing every single piece of undeniable evidence regarding his massive wire fraud and his sickening medical forgery. The neighbors were already standing on their front lawns watching the spectacular downfall of the neighborhood bully. As the uniformed police officers stepped out of their vehicles and approached him, Matthew collapsed heavily to his knees on the hard concrete sidewalk. He looked up at me, his face completely broken, soaked in tears, and totally defeated. He finally asked the one burning question that had been destroying his mind since I first walked through those mahogany front doors. He asked me how a retired construction worker living on a miserable monthly pension could possibly afford to buy an entire international corporate holding company. I looked down at his pathetic kneeling form and decided to give him the absolute final devastating piece of the puzzle. I spoke softly so only he could hear. I told him that the crisp, folded piece of paper sitting in my front pocket on the exact day he violently threw me out of his house was a verified winning lottery ticket worth exactly $20 million. I stood perfectly still and watched his bloodshot eyes widen in absolute pure horror as the sheer catastrophic magnitude of his terrible mistake finally crushed his soul. If he had just shown me a single ounce of basic human decency, if he had just treated me like a father instead of a useless parasite, he would have naturally inherited an absolute unimaginable fortune. Instead, he had permanently traded $20 million for a few fleeting moments of cruel, arrogant dominance. I handed the thick, heavy dossier of evidence directly to the lead police officer without saying another word. I turned my back on my weeping son and walked slowly back up the driveway toward my newly reclaimed estate, leaving him sitting alone on the cold, wet curb, forced to listen to the terrifying metallic sound of handcuffs clicking firmly around his wrists. A full month has passed since that chaotic night of absolute reckoning. I am sitting peacefully on the beautiful sunlit terrace of my private stone villa in Tuscany, looking out over the rolling green hills and the endless, sprawling rows of grapevines. The morning air is incredibly crisp, smelling faintly of wild lavender and fresh earth. The dark, heavy bruises on my ribs have completely faded away, and the deep, agonizing emotional wounds that haunted me for years have finally healed over. I pour myself a fresh cup of rich, dark espresso and open the encrypted morning report sent across the ocean by Oliver. The massive, sprawling estate back in America looks completely different now. I did not sell the beautiful property to another wealthy, arrogant family. I absolutely refused to let the house I built with my own bare hands become another hollow monument to greedy suburban vanity. Instead, I instructed Oliver to legally transfer the entire property and all of its assets to a newly formed charitable trust. The custom mahogany wine cellar my son illegally built using stolen money has been completely ripped out of the basement and replaced with a state-of-the-art physical therapy room. The luxurious master bedroom where Vanessa used to selfishly record her fake lifestyle videos has been fully transformed into a bright, comfortable communal living space filled with soft chairs and enormous bookshelves. The house is now an entirely fully funded, subsidized shelter for displaced and abused senior citizens. It provides a safe, beautiful, and absolutely permanent sanctuary for older men and women who have been cruelly cast aside, mistreated, or financially abandoned by their own ungrateful families. I look closely at the high-resolution digital photos Oliver included in his comprehensive report, showing elderly residents sitting peacefully in the very same backyard where I was once shoved into the dirt. I see a woman named Margaret, who was thrown out by her daughter, resting comfortably by the pool. They are smiling warmly, drinking herbal tea, and enjoying the bright morning sunshine without any lingering fear of being called a burden. My life legacy is no longer tragically tied to the cruel boy I raised. My legacy is now firmly rooted in providing absolute comfort, fierce protection, and deep dignity to those who desperately need it most. As for Matthew, his federal criminal trial is officially scheduled to begin early next year. Oliver informed me that the sheer overwhelming volume of concrete digital evidence we provided has made it completely impossible for his court-appointed public defender to negotiate any kind of lenient plea deal. He is facing severe mandatory federal prison sentences for the wire fraud, the massive mortgage falsification, and the horrific medical forgery. Vanessa completely vanished after that night, quickly filing for divorce and leaving him to face the crushing, suffocating weight of his massive hidden debts entirely alone. He has tried to call me several times from the cold county jail, desperately begging for money to hire a private defense attorney. I instructed the prison telephone system to permanently block his calls. There are some heavy doors that once closed must never be opened again. I refuse to let the toxic, draining poison of his endless entitlement seep back into the peaceful, quiet life I have so carefully built. I take a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my warm espresso and listen to the gentle rustling of the Italian wind blowing softly through the silver leaves of the olive trees. The birds are singing a cheerful melody above me. I did not just barely survive my son's terrible cruelty. I surgically removed a massive malignant cancer from my life and completely reclaimed my absolute total freedom. I learned the hard way that true genuine family is not automatically defined by shared blood or a shared last name. True family is built entirely on an unshakable foundation of mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and a pure, unconditional love that never demands total self-destruction. I finally learned to love value and fiercely protect myself just as much as I had protected others my entire life. The long silent correction is completely finished, and the endless, beautiful peace I now feel every single morning was truly worth every single tear I ever shed. The most profound lesson from this journey is that unconditional love should never become a weapon used for our own destruction. We are often taught that family is a permanent bond defined strictly by blood, and that we must endlessly sacrifice our peace to protect our children from their mistakes. But true family is actually defined by mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and shared values. When we continuously shield arrogant people from the natural consequences of their actions, we do not save them. We simply build a fragile illusion that eventually collapses. Finding the courage to walk away and establish absolute boundaries is the ultimate act of self-preservation. If you believe that respect must always be earned, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own story in the comments below.